Intermezzo, in sadness and in joy. Cotton Mather hardly ended his influence at the end of the trials. Oh, no, he had a lot more to do. Pamphlets to write, a congregation to preach at, and all the books and trimmings that had always been a part of his life. The next siege would sweep not just 1 or 2 small towns, but the whole of Boston up in a frenzied heap. I do apologize once more. Not because I do not know what happened between sieges 2 and 3, but because I cannot bring myself to describe the events to detail. Quite simply, that beautiful young love, Abigail, had died. So he married one Elizabeth. Eventually, she died. Of his 15 children by both women, only 6 survived their mothers. Cotton's own mother shortly joined Abigail and Elizabeth. Whether I cannot or will not say what sort of grief occurred in those years, I must not forget Cotton's own prayer. O my dear Saviour, if thou shalt be most glorified by my having this taken from me, I resign it. I forego it. I am content and willing to be without it. Despite these courageous words, he would hold on dearly to what he had left, including another wife, the stubborn Lydia Lee George, and to brave the siege to come. Siege 3. The Pox. The 3 years before 1721 were filled with tension and foreboding. Cotton Mather had noticed that about every 12 years, with amazing regularity, a smallpox epidemic arose in the colonies. He calculated the next one to appear around 1714. It did not. By 1718, officials were worried enough to set up a quarantine on infected ships. At the end of 1720, so strong was the feeling that disease was at the doorstep, both Cotton and Increase Mather preached about impending danger on the horizon. On the horizon, indeed. One unfortunate ship, unaware of the dormant pox they carried, sailed straight past the quarantine and into Boston. Oh, unfortunate sailors, joyous in their revelries, who, unwitting, spread the smallpox into every frequented tavern and merrily disposed corner of the port. Oh, poor souls, whose joy would soon end in painful death. Cotton Mather heard of the smallpox very soon after it began. Now that death was no longer crouching on their doorsteps, but over the stoop and warming its feet by the fire, people flocked to churches, despite the fact that they might come into contact with the disease there. They wanted to hear about how they might save their souls, if not their bodies. Mather used this opportunity to speak a sermon straight into the hearts of his congregation, to best move them toward Christ. But he knew that while saving souls was essential, he might not be able to help all those souls that died. He could not condemn them, he felt, merely because he refused to take action on a different level than that of minister. Fearing for both his family and spiritual community, Cotton Mather whipped out a letter to some Boston doctors. He knew exactly what he wanted done. In fact, he had known it for the past 5 years. He discovered a strange technique for combating smallpox from his faithful African slave, Onesimus. It would come to be called inoculation, and it usually involved placing a scab from a previous smallpox victim into an incision on the patient's arm. The patient would then have a case of smallpox, much milder than if he had caught it from somebody else. If you could afford and survive the procedure, it was well worth it, because, on average, smallpox could severely infect a person only once. It was, indeed, a cure. However, of all the doctors in Boston, only one responded to cotton. Zabdiel Boylston was a doctor as interesting as his name, and he was known for his risky but successful surgical procedures. But now, as the siege of the pox wore on, and Dr. Boylston began the first inoculation on his own son, a battle brewed within Boston. Besides the eccentric Boylston, most doctors refused to accept the so-called cure, because it was so different than their traditional methods, and they didn't want to be responsible if it failed. The government actually prohibited inoculation at that time. Our eccentric friend, of course, went on with his work, ignoring the law completely. On the other end of the spectrum from those doctors were the ministers of Boston, who wanted to protect their congregation as much as possible by new discoveries in God's world. Things got much worse that fall, when the smallpox was at its worst, and somebody tried to bomb Cotton Mather's house because the minister continued to publicly advocate inoculation. Finally, a little less than a year after the epidemic began, and about 900 deaths later, inoculation was again legal. Though officials were angry at Mather and Boylston, who had to forswear for their inoculation, the procedure had proved a success. Only 6 patients died out of the 242 people Boylston inoculated. Penultima, as long as we both shall live. After the epidemic, Cotton Mather went through several coughs, fevers, and other illnesses. He wrote important books. He went about life as usual. But he was different. He was old. He celebrated his 60th birthday the year following the smallpox epidemic, which was older, far older than he'd ever bargained for. His hot-tempered wife, Lydia Lee George, got more and more difficult over the years, and she angrily left him in 1724. He now had only his 3 remaining children to comfort him. Final siege. The grave. In the autumn of 1727, the whole of Boston shook. Quite literally, Massachusetts was undergoing the worst season of earthquakes since the Pilgrims arrived. Again, people flocked to Cotton Mather's church, fearing for their souls and the judgment of God. On the day before Christmas, though the earth trembled on, Cotton Mather spoke to the church. He spoke on death. Not in a foreboding way, but a comforting manner. He did not preach again. And is this dying? This all? Is it no more than this? Oh, I can bear this. I can bear it. At Cotton's bedside, someone remarked that his prayers for an easy death had been answered. Grace. And that was all. It was February 13th, 1728, the day after his 65th birthday. Cotton Mather, the minister, scientist, husband, and father, was dead. Though the earthquakes only continued into September, the name of Cotton Mather was engraved on the history of America forever, for good and for bad, in sickness and in health, in sadness and in joy, as long as you and I shall live, and beyond. The works referenced for this shadow biography are The Life and Times of Cotton Mather by Kenneth Silverman, Welcome Rain Publishers, New York, 1984. The Pox and the Covenant, Mather, Franklin, and the Epidemic That Changed America's Destiny, by Tony Williams, Sourcebooks Incorporated, 2010. True Crime, an American Anthology, edited by Harold Schechter, The Library of America, 2008. You Wouldn't Want to Be a Salem Witch, by Jim Pipe, illustrated by David Antrim, Franklin Watts, 2009. Script written and performed by Hannah Spangler. Puppetry designed, performed, and filmed by the same.